Good evening, everybody. Oh, I like that. As an ex-teacher, I do like a little bit of back and forth. It's lovely to see so many of you here. A warm welcome to the St Magnus Centre here in Kirkwall on what is St Magnus Day. So what better day to begin what we hope will be a series of talks from the wonderful Fran. But before we get into the business of that tonight, could I ask you to check to see that your mobile phones are switched off or in silent mode? We're not anticipating any fire practice or any spontaneous combustion, but should there be anything of that nature, as I always say, follow Les, he'll be the fastest person out the door headed for the exits, which are basically as you came in tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Elaine Grieve, and I am the Lord Lieutenant of Orkney, and one of the absolute joys of the role that I have is to act as the chair of the Society of the Friends of St Magnus Cathedral. Now, the Friends, as we affectionately call ourselves, was established almost 70 years ago now to have many functions and purposes, but chief amongst those was to help support the maintenance and preservation of the magnificent St Magnus Cathedral. But another of those purposes was to promote and educate the public about the cathedral, about its history in the community of Orkney, and the ways in which it has become integral to this community. Because, as many of you may know, the cathedral does not belong to any denominational church. It belongs to the people of Orkney, and because of that, we all cherish it, perhaps more deeply than we would otherwise have done. It is my absolute pleasure tonight just to say a few words before Fran, in her role as Cathedral Curator. What a fantastic job. You know, she gets to dig in all those dusty boxes and look under things in the cathedral and discover scribbled things on stones. And it must be one of the best jobs in the world, and I, for one, envy you that opportunity. And what we do hope is that we will be able to hear more about the things that Fran has uncovered and discovered as time goes on. But tonight, for the first of these talks, she has chosen a subject which really is from the fairly recent past. And we go back now almost 86 years to the fateful night of the sinking of HMS Royal Oak. And the Royal Oak has an association with the cathedral through the people of Orkney, and that's what Fran will take us through tonight. My mother was 11 and a half, very important, 11 and a half, when the Second World War broke out. She grew up in Long Hope on the island of Hoy, the southernmost tip, and she and her 6 siblings used to love to play on the beach, all of the things that island kids do. Her father had established a shop at the top of the pier in Long Hope just before the First World War. So he was experienced and understood what would happen to the community when war broke out. So at a very impressionable age, Mum shifted from a young girl growing up on a small Scottish island to a young girl growing up on a small Scottish island where the population had increased exponentially. 12,000 personnel serving the naval base at Linus, camps around the house where Mum grew up. She would speak affectionately about her pet dog running amok in the sergeant's mess in the field across the way. And for Mum, she freely admitted that as a child, that had improved her life incredibly. It was much more exciting. You know, she got to go and work in the shop, and she said all these people would be coming down the pier off ships, and she realised that these were sailors of some of the ships stationed in Scapa Flow. And she told me and my brothers that even at a tender young age of 11 and a half, she remembered being told that HMS Royal Oak had been sunk with all hands, mostly, lost. And that had a huge impact upon her for the rest of her life. And it is with that feeling of impact, which resonated not only throughout Orkney, but resonated obviously throughout the UK and beyond. That sacrifice will not be forgotten in Orkney. It will never be forgotten. And it's important that we all remember those who lost their lives. And through the work that Fran's undertaken, we won't, because she will share with us what she has discovered. And the cathedral will always hold the memory of those who lost their lives. So I'm going to stop, because you don't want to listen to me. You want to listen to somebody who actually does know a bit about it. More than a bit about it, actually. So, please, will you welcome with me Fran Hollinrake, the Cathedral Curator. I always want to call you Custodian. I'm stuck in the bad. Curator, welcome, Fran.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. That was a lovely introduction. Normally when I do talks, I throw up some pictures and then I kind of freestyle it, you know, and we just have a chat and I tell you about the pictures and we just kind of have a bit of a blether. Things are going to be a little bit different tonight, which is probably why I'm unduly nervous about this, because I'm actually going to read this one out for two reasons. If I don't, then I might go off on all sorts of tangents and we might be here for a lot longer than anyone anticipated. But secondly, I don't want to miss anything out. I want all the information that I have available to be out there for you and for everybody else that's going to listen to it. So the talk is called In Some Sort of Quietude, the Memorial to HMS Royal Oak. And the reason why I have chosen that title will become obvious at some point in the talk, why I have chosen that particular phrase. So it looks like a lot, but it's at 14 point, Ariel. So hopefully you'll find it interesting. In Some Sort of Quietude, the Memorial to HMS Royal Oak in St Magnus Cathedral. Since the end of the Second World War, the way in which the British public memorialises the casualties of war has changed considerably. This paper presents a case study telling the story of one memorial dedicated to Navy battleship HMS Royal Oak, situated in St Magnus Cathedral, Orkney. The memorial has grown from a modest bronze plaque pinned to the wall of a side aisle to an elaborate and ornate shrine to those lost. St Magnus Cathedral stands in the centre of Kirkwall, principal town of the Orkney Islands off the north coast of Scotland. It was founded in 1137 at a time when Orkney was part of the Kingdom of Norway and the diocese was governed by the Archdiocese of Nidaros, based in Trondheim. In 1468, Orkney was ceded to Scotland in lieu of a marriage dowry, with the cathedral diocese moving to the control of the Archbishopric of St Andrews. A few years later, in 1486, King James III of Scots granted Kirkwall a royal charter and made the town a royal borough, at the same time handing the cathedral into the care of the people of Kirkwall. Following the creation of Orkney Islands Council in 1975, the cathedral now belongs to the people of Orkney. The cathedral was built to the glory of God at a time when the creation of churches, abbeys, cathedrals and religious institutions flourished across Europe. It also served as a pilgrimage destination and housed the relics of two local saints, Magnus and Ronald. It is still very much the spiritual heart of the community, and in nearly 900 years, it has seen the great sweep of history pass through: revolution, reformation and restoration, as well as weddings, funerals, baptisms and memorial services for many generations of Orcadians. These red sandstone walls have witnessed and absorbed untold numbers of prayers, joy, grief and hope, and provided the backdrop and the framework for some of Orkney's most momentous occasions. It is fitting then that it should be the site of a memorial to the Royal Naval battleship HMS Royal Oak, sunk in Scapa Flow on the 14th of October 1939. Orkney has in its midst one of the largest natural harbours. Scapa Flow covers over 120 square miles of sheltered water, fringed by a necklace of fertile, low-lying islands. Orkney has been inhabited, so far as can be ascertained, for around 10,000 years. And from about 3000 BCE, the inhabitants farmed and built monumental structures in the form of standing stones and chambered cairns, as well as domestic dwellings and large settlements that seem to be a mixture of both. From the 9th century onwards, Orkney suffered, or benefited, from the attention of the Norsemen, raiders, traders and colonisers from Scandinavia, looking for lands into which they could expand. By the early 12th century, Orkney was firmly established as an earldom of Norway, with semi-autonomous jarls ruling a land of plenty in the heart of a seafaring Norse empire. To modernise, Orkney seems remote and peripheral. In the Middle Ages, it was at the centre of a great network of sea roads and trading routes, with the Orcadian Norse men and women travelling far and wide. In the early 1100s, Orkney was governed peacefully by two earls, Erland and Paul. On their deaths, the earldom was passed eventually to their sons, Magnus and his cousin Haakon. They had very different personalities, so the Orkneyinga saga tells us, with Haakon showing traits of his more warlike Viking ancestors and Magnus preferring the company of monks and peacemakers. At Eastertide, about the year 1117, Magnus and Haakon met on Egglesea, one of the smallest of the Orkney Islands, and under the control of Bishop William. The bishop had planned to broker a peace deal, but events overtook him, and Haakon had Magnus condemned to death as a traitor. The execution was swift and brutal. An axe blow to the head later, Magnus was dead, and Haakon was the sole ruler of Orkney. Magnus was buried in Bursey, where he had grown up. Heavenly lights, divine fragrances, and healing miracles were reported soon after. Sainthood followed in 1135, with the cathedral founded 2 years later by Magnus's nephew Ronald, consecrated by about 1150. The Vikings used Orkney as a safe harbour on the sea road, the islands perfectly positioned in the centre of a powerful kingdom, which ran from the coast of Norway west to Iceland, then south through Shetland, Orkney, the Western Isles, Caithness, Sutherland, and down the Irish Sea to Dublin and the Isle of Man. From there, the Norse raiders and traders could strike out down the Bay of Biscay and through the Mediterranean to the Middle East. The island archipelago was similarly geographically poised in the 1910s as the rumours of war grew louder and the rulers of Europe began to look to their country's defences. Many thousands of Navy and Army personnel were based in Orkney during the First World War, when it was decided that Scapa Flow would be the home base for the Grand Fleet in 1914. In the early part of the 20th century, the upper levels of St Magnus Cathedral were open to any members of the public brave enough to climb the spiral stone staircases. Many did, including the men of several Royal Navy ships who were stationed in Scapa Flow as part of the Grand Fleet, amongst them 4 young Devon men serving on the balloon ship HMS Canning. Their pencilled name and date graffiti can still be seen in the southwest Triforium. And there it is. The Admiralty recognised the importance of protecting the fleet whilst in port. The southern entrances, Hoxha and Swither Sounds, were guarded by booms, as was the western approach through Hoy Sound. These points of entry were also guarded by gun batteries for attacking surface craft. The eastern entrances to Scapa Flow were efficiently closed by block ships, a motley mixture of transatlantic passenger ships, Clydeside cargo boats, and Royal Mail steam packets. They were sailed into place and then deliberately sunk. Having done their duty and prevented enemy attack during the First World War, the block ships in Ham Sound became a great bone of contention between the Navy and the local community, with the latter pressing for their removal throughout the 1920s. Salvage rights were sold, but attempts were later abandoned due to the ship's poor condition. At the resumption of war in 1939, another 2 block ships were sunk, and another was planned, but the Admiralty was complacent, relying on existing block ships along with strong tides and currents to deter any attack. They believed entry by enemy vessels to be all but impossible. But possible it was. On the evening of the 13th of October 1939, a mere 6 weeks into the war, a German submarine, U-47, crept through the block ships and into the flow. As fate had it, most of the fleet were absent, but a few ships remained, including one of the Navy's capital ships, HMS Royal Oak. She was an old ship by then, one of the 5 Revenge-class super dreadnoughts, begun in 1914 and commissioned in 1916, just in time to see action at the Battle of Jutland in July that year. After a full refit, she was battle-ready once more. But by 1939, she was one of the oldest ships in the fleet, with a much lower sailing speed than the other battleships. In October of that year, HMS Royal Oak was equipped with extra AA guns and was positioned in Scapa Bay to provide anti-aircraft cover for the flow and the onshore radar station at Netherbutton in Ham. Kapitän Leutnant Günther Prien, captain of U-47, saw his chance and took it. The U-boat fired a salvo of torpedoes shortly after midnight, with one striking the anchor chain. Although there was consternation on board, there was no suspicion that they were under enemy attack. Shortly after 1 a.m. on the 14th of October, a further volley was fired and hit the ship side on. HMS Royal Oak sank within 15 minutes. Out of a crew of over 1,200 officers and men, 835 lost their lives. Survivors, picked up by Daisy 2, a local drifter attached to the battleship, talked of men being dragged into the cold, dark water. They described how they had swum blindly through a lake of choking oil, desperately hoping for land or rescue. As badly burned survivors were retrieved from the water, the Navy cast large fishermen's nets over the disaster area to prevent bodies from floating away. The war diary entry for the 14th of October betrays a sense of urgency, working on the assumption that the U-boat was still in Scapa Flow. It wasn't, Prien having made a daring exit. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, told a shocked House of Commons, "When we consider that during the whole course of the last war, this anchorage was found to be immune from such attacks on account of the obstacles imposed by the currents and the net barrages, this entry by a U-boat must be considered as a remarkable exploit of professional skill and daring." Such admiration for the enemy notwithstanding, the loss of HMS Royal Oak was a bitter blow to morale, particularly coming so early in the war. I was reading this earlier on. This is the first official communiqué that came out about the sinking of the ship. And there was a couple of things that caught my eye. About 3/4 of the way down, use every possible means, including aircraft, to prevent submarine getting out and informing German Admiralty. They thought the U-boat was still in the flow. And right at the bottom it says, "No reference to Royal Oak to be made in plain language until further orders. This includes lists of survivors." This is the immediate aftermath of the sinking of the ship, and you can feel the anxiety, you can feel the panic in that document there. In total, the bodies of only 26 casualties were recovered, and they now lie in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission Lioness Royal Naval Cemetery on the island of Hoy. They were buried very quickly, with the survivors who attended the service dressed in mismatched uniforms and ill-fitting boots, their own clothing having been damaged or destroyed. For the remaining 809 men and boys, HMS Royal Oak is their permanent resting place. Following the war, the nation and Orkney tried to determine an appropriate response to the horrors of the conflict. Following the First World War, there had been many Orcadian lives to commemorate. The creation of the Imperial War Graves Commission in 1917 ensured that British Armed Forces personnel casualties were identified and recorded wherever possible in all parts of the world. The IWGC, now the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, is still responsible for the commemoration of 1.7 million British and Commonwealth graves. But the organisation has no remit for local war memorials. The CWGC does, however, hold a register of war memorials and states, "War memorials form an important part of the UK's cultural heritage. They reflect the changing face of commemoration as well as artistic, social, military and international history. Each war memorial presents a unique record of the past, as with no central organisation for their creation, the design and wording on the memorials were chosen by the communities who created them." It had taken until 1923 for the Kirkwall and St Ola War Memorial to be constructed following the First World War. Built out of Aberdeen granite, it forms an imposing gate into the cathedral graveyard, a large stone arch topped with the torch-carrying Angel of Mercy and carved with the names of the fallen of the parish, 138 in total. There were months of discussion as to the style, location and materials to be used, but eventually the winning tender was from the Aberdeen firm of Garden and Company. In their bid, they stated, "Your cathedral is one you have every title to be proud of. In fact, we think it is unique in Scotland in being the only cathedral which forms a complete cross. But it has no gateway to its churchyard. And our unhesitating opinion is that a gateway cenotaph is by far the most suitable form the memorial can take. Your cathedral being largely Norman in character, we have kept this fact in view in designing the archway so as to have the memorial in keeping with the cathedral." And there it is, Norman archway. On the 17th of October 1923, the memorial was unveiled by General Lord Horne in the presence of local dignitaries and some 3,000 local people. Lord Horne, a native of Caithness, had commanded artillery units in some of the major theatres of the war and was rewarded with a peerage. His speech spoke of the great loss felt by the community and also for the need to help wounded servicemen who were struggling. Photographs of the event, taken by local photographer Tom Kent, show the memorial shrouded in Union flags, which were then drawn apart by Lord Horne to reveal the two columns of names. The members of the crowd, many of them the mothers, fathers, wives, siblings and children of those commemorated, are wrapped up warm against the October chill. Hymns were sung and the local pipe band played the Scottish lament, "The Flowers of the Forest." On Sunday, the 11th of November of that year, the war memorial for the cathedral congregation was unveiled in the northwest aisle in an impressive ceremony. This polished marble slab bears the name of 52 men who worshipped in the church but who did not survive the war. The Reverend William Barclay, minister of the cathedral, welcomed the packed congregation within the sacred precincts of this, the wonder and glory of the North, where for so many centuries men and women had brought their burdens of joy and sorrow, of ambition and inspiration. The honour of the unveiling fell to Captain Gordon Sutherland of Stronsay, two of whose brothers are named on the memorial. Across Orkney, war memorials were unveiled throughout the early 1920s in solemn, dignified and grief-laden ceremonies, attended by local people who could never have envisaged that fewer than 20 years later, war was to dominate their lives again. The sinking of HMS Royal Oak in her home port in 1939 was a heavy blow. The first suggestion for a memorial inside the cathedral in memory of the casualties of HMS Royal Oak came in autumn 1947. This contrasted with the prevailing feeling of many British people that instead of more war memorials, a better way to remember the dead was to build parks and civic amenities. Throughout the country, names were added to existing First World War memorials, but very few new ones appeared. National feeling notwithstanding, the Kirkwall Town Council received a letter from the resident naval officer at Lyoness, Commander Claude Edward Luckley Slater. And this is him. Not an Orkney Slater. I did try to establish if there was any local connection, and there was not. His family were from the south of England. This splendid portrait was done by Peter Scott, artist, naturalist, and son of Robert Falcon Scott, who was known personally to Claude Slater. Slater was himself a survivor of the Royal Oak's sinking. He went on to have an illustrious Navy career. He had command of 2 ships during the war, receiving DSO and bar for actions in which he was involved, most notably commanding HMS Wild Swan, which, returning from escorting supply convoys, came under aerial attack from 12 German Junkers 88 planes. The Wild Swan managed to shoot down 6 of them before she was sunk herself. Another letter was sent to Kirkwall Town Council from the Reverend G. Arthur Fryer, minister of the cathedral, in tandem with that of Commander Slater. Both letters requested that a memorial plaque be erected to the officers and men of HMS Royal Oak sunk in Scapa Bay. This initial request was considered for a month by the Kirkwall Town Council before they deferred a decision for more discussion. The minutes of that second meeting record that it was agreed to reply to the Navy that the Council considers that a memorial erected on the cliff overlooking the scene of the disaster or in Lyoness Naval Cemetery would be more appropriate, and that a fund for this purpose might be opened within the Royal Navy and, if need be, extended to the public. After further pressure was brought to bear, the Kirkwall Town Council finally relented and agreed to grant permission to the Admiralty to erect a memorial plaque, provided that the plaque is of reasonable size and with the cost resting entirely with the Royal Navy. A cast bronze plaque was ready by May 1948, and it just remained for the members of the Town Council to adjourn to the cathedral and determine the position near to the existing war memorial on that wall. The spot chosen was in the north aisle of the cathedral nave. The nave, the long part of a cruciform church running from west to the crossing, takes its name from the word navis, Latin for ship. In Christian symbolism, the ship represented the church as a whole, as well as bringing to mind the saving of mankind in Noah's Ark. Navis is also the roots of the word navigate and navy. Perhaps this informed the decision to site the plaque in a place of sanctuary and safety, the ship part of the cathedral, as well as a location close to the existing war memorial. At a ceremony held on the 14th of October that year, 9 years to the day after the sinking of HMS Royal Oak, the presiding church minister, the Reverend G. Arthur Fryer, was joined by various Kirkwall dignitaries, including the Provost, Robert Slater, and the Lord Lieutenant, Patrick Sutherland Graham, representatives from the Royal Navy, amongst them Resident Naval Officer Commander Slater, and about 20 survivors who had made the journey from their hometowns. Also present was retired Rear Admiral W.G. Benn, captain of the ship when she sank. Benn addressed the congregation, relating that it was the survivors' wish that the memorial be erected. There was, he said, a small sum of money in one of the ship's funds, and they had asked that it might be spent in providing a memorial to their comrades. This memorial, he went on to say, I entrust to your charge in your ancient cathedral. It is very fitting that it should be placed here. Furthermore, he noted that the waters around these islands are hallowed by very heavy naval losses. It is left to us now to contend for the freedom of the human spirit. As the memorial was unveiled by Rear Admiral Benn, a Royal Marine bugler played the last post, followed by Reveille. Organ music, including Nimrod from Elgar's Enigma Variations, was provided by Harry Croft Jackson, who, having left his position as cathedral organist, would go on to become a music commissioner for the BBC. The cast bronze plaque measures 300 millimetres by 240 millimetres and bears these words: in memory of 833 officers and men of HMS Royal Oak who lost their lives when their ship was sunk in Scapa Bay by U-47 on the 14th of October 1939. At the time of the sinking, it was believed that the number of casualties was 833, but subsequent research has revised that to 835. Provost Robert Slater, representing the Kirkwall Town Council, and the Reverend G. Arthur Fryer, on behalf of the Church of Scotland congregation, declared that they would undertake the safekeeping of the plaque. Just a few years later, in the winter of 1959, the Ministry of Defence invited tenders for the salvage rights to HMS Royal Oak. A storm of public protest followed, with Orcadians expressing their outrage in the letters pages of the local newspapers. I feel I must join with others in a protest against the desecration of the tomb. I cannot put into words how very grieved I was to read about the proposed plan, wrote one who reveres their memory. However, letter writer Realist responded by saying, I have been surprised by the over-emotionalism and a bit embarrassed by the County Council's theatricals. In the event, the invitation to tender was withdrawn and the ship was left in peace. In those post-war years, the wreck site of the ship attracted the attention of local, national and international divers and sub-aqua clubs. For many years, HMS Royal Oak was not an officially protected site, but it was hoped that divers would respect the ship as a war grave. Local rumour would suggest that that did not always happen. But as time passes, the men whose names crop up most frequently are now gone from this world and they cannot tell their stories. One anecdote demonstrates the attraction that the wreck held for amateur divers. In the 1970s, one member of a sub-aqua club from England was diving in Scapa Flow. He had a particular goal in mind: to liberate the large brass letters fixed with steel bolts that then adorned the hull of HMS Royal Oak, spelling out the name of the ship. Having spent every day of his holiday diving on the wreck and prizing off the letters, he succeeded in carrying home all but one letter. This was sent to him by a friend the following year. Now, this is where we head into slightly more anecdotal territory, because I heard this story from my friend Tom Muir. He said that he managed to jemmy off all the letters, but the one he had a lot of trouble with was the second A in Oak. And he managed to eventually jemmy it off, and he dropped it. And it went down the water and landed on the seabed. But he was out of time, and he was just about out of air, and he needed to get back to the surface. So he had to leave it. The next year, a friend of his came back to Orkney, and he was told exactly where he would find it, the missing letter, and he retrieved it, and he went to the Kirkwall post office, and he sent a telegram to his friend, and it simply said, A-OK. The diver, in fact, if you look at the second A, don't know if you can see the right-hand leg of the A is slightly bent, that's why. The diver and the letters eventually migrated to Canada, where in 1994 they were donated anonymously to the Royal Canadian Navy, who in turn gave them to the British Royal Navy. Mounted on a mahogany backboard, the letters were handed over to Orkney Islands Council in 1995, and they are now on display at Scapa Flow Museum. Other artefacts, the results of unauthorised diving expeditions in those unregulated days, still come to light. As for the cathedral plaque, the 1970s guidebook states, "Modern taste favours small plaques and simple inscriptions." In 1979, amateur filmmaker Graham Campbell and diver Doug Howells assembled a group of divers with the aim of filming the wreck. Some in Orkney felt this was an unnecessary and disrespectful activity. In a letter to the Orcadian, Bertie Johnston, the only Orkney man on the ship to survive, wrote, "What possible benefit can anybody get from photographing the coffin of over 800 sailors? This nonsensical, unsavoury documentary should be stopped at once." However, having obtained permission from the Admiralty, the expedition went ahead. The Scotland and Northern Ireland clearance diving team were instructed to accompany them, to offer support and assistance, and to ensure that no unauthorised salvage was carried out. The Royal Oak film expedition of July and August 1979 saw a team of 16 divers filming the wreck over a period of 2 weeks. Photographic images were taken, showing the wreck and surrounding area, and although not up to the standards of today's underwater imaging, some interesting things were found. Great excitement arose with the discovery of a bell, half buried on the seabed underneath the overhanging quarterdeck. One Navy diver has a clear memory of seeing it and states that there was a large clapper still inside the bell. In fact, you can see it in the photograph. A photo from the expedition confirms this. On returning to the surface, the Navy divers contacted their senior officer in Rosyth, splendidly named Lieutenant Commander John Bellchambers. His instructions were swift and clear: bury the bell. Attempts were made to do so, but it proved impossible given the constraints of equipment and diving time. Further instructions came from HQ: bury it somewhere inside the ship where nobody would ever be able to find or retrieve it. With the use of a lifting bag, a buoyancy aid made with inflatable balloons, the bell was manoeuvred to a location inside the ship. By this point, the clapper had gone, and to date, it remains missing. The bell was buried open mouth up, filled with random debris and covered over. Local interest in the filming of the wreck coincided with a growing feeling that the small, understated bronze plaque in the cathedral was not a sufficient reflection of the strength and feeling about the tragedy. A year later, the Admiralty relented and gave permission for the bell to be salvaged and brought to the surface in June 1981. Council employee and Royal British Legion stalwart Charlie Miller was given the task of cleaning up the bell, stripping it of encrustation and barnacles and polishing it to a high shine. Now, since the 1970s, St Magnus Cathedral has had a consultant architect who carries out regular surveys and advises on building conservation. In 1981, Michael Menim, working for architects Ferry and Menim in York, was in communication with the Chief Executive of Orkney Islands Council and the Society of the Friends of St Magnus about designing a new HMS Royal Oak memorial. The Society, a charity known locally as the Friends, was founded in 1958 as a means of raising money for the preservation and conservation of the cathedral. The Society's chair is the sitting Lord Lieutenant of Orkney, and in the early 1980s that position was held by Colonel Robert McRae, a retired officer of the Seaforth Highlanders. In 1972, McRae had been recently appointed to the role of Queen's representative when structural surveys revealed that the cathedral was in serious danger of collapse. He instigated and drove a worldwide fundraising campaign which ensured the continued survival of the church. It was this drive and determination to continue to honour those lost on HMS Royal Oak which led Colonel McRae to oversee the creation of a new memorial through the Friends and the Cathedral Committee of Orkney Islands Council. Architect Michael Menim drew up plans for the memorial, a mahogany backboard incorporating 2 flags, a Union flag and a white ensign, and the original bronze plaque. A year later, the design was revised. The centrepiece of the memorial was to be the newly recovered bell. The requirement for an enhanced memorial was once again in contrast to the general countrywide feelings about war memorials and remembrance. The demand for new and different memorials would grow considerably from the mid-1980s onwards, but in 1981 the mood was still for practicality and understated restraint. It may have been that the interest in Orkney for a bigger memorial to HMS Royal Oak came from a renewed interest in the ship following the film expedition of 1979. Those involved in the creation of the enhanced memorial felt that a new location was required, subject to the approval of Flag Officer Scotland and Northern Ireland. The North Choir Aisle was deemed to be a suitable position, and the choice was deeply symbolic. The choir is the oldest part of the cathedral, the first section to be built. It was in medieval times also the holiest part, housing as it did the shrines of St Magnus and St Ronald and the high altar. Nestling within the 12th century Romanesque arches, the memorial was to take its place in the spiritual heart of St Magnus Cathedral. Above the proposed site shines a stained glass window depicting the Apostle St Jude, patron saint of lost causes, the hopeless and the despairing. His feast day is the 28th of October, a fortnight after the anniversary of the sinking of HMS Royal Oak. The ceremony on the 14th of October 1981 to unveil and dedicate the new memorial was a solemn one, attended by the Reverend Bill Cant, Cathedral Minister, Colonel Robert McRae, Lord Lieutenant of Orkney and Chair of the Friends, and Captain Barry Wallace, Chief of Staff to Flag Officer Scotland, Northern Ireland. Once again, the lament, The Flowers of the Forest, was played by the local pipe major. The absence of a bell clapper was noted, acknowledged, and turned into a virtue by the Lord Lieutenant, who said that although the bell had seen active service, It could not be rung again. Its silence is a fitting memorial to those who have suffered a long silence. There is nothing so shattering, he said, as the silence which follows a ship sinking beneath the waves. The frame for the memorial was created by local joiner and builder Alfred Flett, with assemblage and details completed by two local craftsmen, Sidney Cromarty and Jock Langscale, following the plans of architect Michael Menim to the letter. The final addition was a carved wooden cherub, part of a dismantled 17th century pew. The symbolism of the winged head was understood to mean that the person's soul had ascended to heaven. I'd just like to say thank you to Charles Tate for this photograph. It's the only one I've ever seen of the memorial at this stage, because there are very few of them, and he managed to provide this one, so thank you very much to Charles for that. It's on the bit of wood underneath, where the light is. I'll point it out if you like to hang on. That's it there. That little wooden cherub is now on display in the triforium upstairs, so you can see him if you want. The flags were provided by the Royal Navy in consultation with the Society of the Friends of St Magnus charity, and advice was sought from Flag Officer Scotland Northern Ireland on the most suitable way to display them. The white ensign has particular significance. The flag is normally reserved for the use of the British Royal Navy and is flown on their ships, submarines, shore bases, and with special permission on government buildings. Since the mid-1970s, it has been common practice for any Royal Navy diving teams surveying HMS Royal Oak to tie a white ensign to the wreck and let it flutter free in the water over the ship. In later years, this tradition has become an annual event, and the flags that are raised to the surface are then given to organisations or individuals who have a link with the ship. Recipients in the past have been the Scottish Maritime Museum, local branches of the British Legion, and latterly relatives of the casualties. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, small acts of commemoration were carried out on or near the anniversary of the ship's sinking. And the local contacts of the Royal Oak Survivors Association, along with the Thurso and Kirkwall branches of the Royal British Legion, assisted relatives and survivors whenever they visited Orkney. As the years went by, more people began to make the long journey to the islands, although the number of survivors was shrinking year by year. In the custodian's office of the cathedral, there hangs a framed letter stating the gratitude felt by the survivors and their families for the care taken by Orkney in looking after the survivors, their families, and the memorial. The text reads, "This citation commemorates the thanks of the Royal Oak Association for the unfailing interest of the Royal British Legion, Kirkwall Branch, the people of Orkney, the Harbours Department of the Orkney Islands Council, St Magnus Cathedral staff, for many years of devoted care to all the visitors and the memorial's maintenance, also the continuing efforts to maintain the memory of lost shipmates." One of the signatories is survivor Kenneth Toop, then Honorary Secretary of the Royal Oak Survivors Association. He was 16 at the time of the sinking. The dwindling presence of those who had survived that night seems to focus attention on the need for all the casualties to be remembered, individually rather than collectively. A proposal was made in 1990, once again at the instigation of Colonel Robert McRae, that a book of remembrance be created and installed in the cathedral as part of the memorial. The Society of Friends was once again to the fore, supporting and funding the work. A local craftsman and furniture maker, Colin Kerr, working on the small island of Edy, producing one-off pieces of furniture, was given the task of making a wooden and glass case to a design drawn up by Richard Carr Archer of architects Ferry and Menim. The plan specified that the case was to be made of English oak with marquetry panels, purple baize cloth and non-reflective glass. A local resident, Kay Gordon, was approached about the artwork and calligraphy for the Book of Remembrance. Mrs. Gordon was the wife of the then Kirkwall Baptist minister, and she was a talented artist. Her husband remembers the enormous care and attention to detail that she took over the artwork, recalling that the sadness of the task frequently overwhelmed her. Throughout the process, the Navy was adding and correcting names, and if a small error was made, she would do the page again. After months of meticulous work, she announced that her technique had improved considerably from when she started. So when she reached the end, she rewrote the whole book from start to finish. Her tribute, she said, to those who had died. Mrs. Gordon's carefully written pages then travelled to York to be bound in leather by William Sessions Limited. Charlie Miller of the Royal British Legion, member of the Friends and singer in the Cathedral Choir, was given the task of laying the book in the newly made case at a special service of dedication. The book has 3 sections. One section lists those who were part of the ship's company. Another section lists those who were on board the ship but were not part of the company. And the third part lists the NAFI staff and the Maltese ratings who were on board. Within each section, the names are laid out alphabetically with the rank and service number alongside. Many of the casualties were listed as boys. Historically, boys were accepted into the Navy at a young age, undergoing several years of training before they were assigned to ships in conflict zones abroad. Of the 835 lost on HMS Royal Oak, 134 of them were classed as boy sailors, aged between 15 and 17. The architect, Richard Carr Archer, who designed the case and coordinated with Mrs. Gordon and the bookbinder in York about the Book of Remembrance, envisaged that the pages would be regularly turned by the cathedral staff in some sort of quietude. This small, low-key ritual takes place every Monday morning, enacted by the Cathedral Visitor Services team. In addition, if the cathedral is visited by relatives of the casualties listed in the book, then the case is opened and the page turned to the relevant name. Conversations with family members can reveal more about the circumstances of the casualty, and this has added significantly to the cathedral archive, as well as the emotional significance of the memorial. And I think I speak for several members of the visitor services team to say we've had some quite emotional moments, haven't we, hearing those stories? Yes, we've all been there. Stephen Claxon, a member of Orkney Islands Council, has a personal connection. His family made the trip to Orkney in April 2000 as they were considering relocating to the islands. His uncle, Ordinary Seaman Ronald Claxon, had died on HMS Royal Oak, so he was interested in seeing the memorial. To my amazement, he says, we found the Book of Remembrance open at the page which included Ronald's name. We took this as a good omen and moved to Orkney. I am pleased that my children had the chance to meet some of the survivors of the sinking and speak to them about their experiences. Last October, I was honoured to be presented with the White Ensign, which has spent the previous year on the wreck. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, the survivors became fewer in number and their visits all the more notable. When members of the Royal Oak Survivors Association visited Orkney, they often came to the cathedral to see the memorial. Survivor Kenneth Toop recalled to cathedral staff that never a day went by when he didn't think about his lost shipmates. The last known survivor, Arthur Smith, died in 2016 at the age of 94. On the 11th of October 2017, there was a break-in at St Magnus Cathedral. A window was broken and there was some damage done to a collection box. In addition, the glass on the case containing the Royal Oak Book of Remembrance had been broken. The perpetrator had tried to open the case, failed, and had smashed the glass in order to access the book. They had lifted the book and turned the pages, but left it in situ. After the initial trauma and shock, the condition of the book was assessed by the curator at Orkney Museum. It was discovered that the binding glue had dried and cracked, and that the pages were becoming detached. The book was sent to Caroline Scharfenberg, a specialist book conservator in Edinburgh, who cleaned the pages and rebound the book. Nearly a year after the break-in, the book was returned, and with due ceremony, it was placed back in its case. In attendance were Museum Curator Rachel Boak, Royal Oak Association Secretary Gareth Derbyshire, and Cathedral Custodian Fran Hollinrake. And there we are. The next adventure. On the 80th anniversary of the sinking of the ship, 2019, the Royal Navy wished to mark the occasion, and they announced their intention of sending HMS Bangor to Scapa Flow to honour their fallen comrades. The Navy Liaison Officer for Scotland, Lieutenant Jen Smith, contacted Orkney Islands Council in September of that year to request that the bell from the ship be borrowed from the cathedral and taken out to sea to be rung out over the wreck of HMS Royal Oak. The lifting and transporting operations were carried out by a detachment of Royal Marines and Orkney Islands Council staff. The bell was taken aboard the Northern Lighthouse vessel Pharos and suspended from a wooden frame. The Pharos, alongside HMS Bangor, held position over the wreck, and a fleet of dive boats and the Kirkwall lifeboat formed a guard of honour, whilst a short service of remembrance was held. At the appropriate moment, able seaman Simon Cox of the Northern Diving Group stepped forward and rang 8 bells, the sound floating out over the waters of Scapa Flow for the first time in 80 years. The tradition of ringing a bell on a Navy ship to mark the passing of the watches is one that goes back many centuries. In times past, a boy would sit with a 30-minute sand glass, and he would ring the bell every time the sand ran through. This developed into a recognised system of communicating the time, with 8 bells signalling the end of a 4-hour watch. It was also the number of rings required to mark a death. Inside St Magnus Cathedral, the walls are lined by carved 17th century gravestones depicting bells in many forms. In Scotland, this is known as the deed bell or dead bell, and it is one of the many reminders of mortality, along with hourglasses with the sands of time expired, extinguished candles, sexton's tools, and the ubiquitous skulls and crossbones. The deed bell was rung to signify a death, and a mixture of handbells and church bells was sounded to give a funeral procession a suitably solemn tone. During the preparations for the 80th anniversary service, it was noted that the bell from HMS Royal Oak did not have a clapper. The Navy provided one for the day in order for the bell to ring out. Following the event, Lord Lieutenant Captain Bill Spence offered to commission a new bell clapper, a parting gift to the cathedral as he stepped down from his role as the Queen's representative in Orkney. John Welsh, a former Tyneside rigger, whose own father, Stoker Petty Officer John Welsh, had survived the sinking of HMS Royal Oak, offered to make a rope tassel for the bell. Throughout 2020, local Orkney craftsman Richard Wilson created a new bespoke clapper for the bell. Due to failing eyesight, John Welsh had passed on the task of making the tassel to his former apprentice, Paul New, who had made many ropes for the Royal Navy and had dived several times in Scapa Flow. New was honoured to create the bell rope, saying he was doing it for all the men still on board. On the 13th of October 2021, the bell parts were assembled and unveiled in front of a small gathering of people, including Captain Bill Spence, Councillor Stephen Claxon, Cathedral Minister the Reverend Fraser McNaughton, Lord Lieutenant Elaine Grieve, John and Tracy Welsh, Richard Wilson and family, and Fran Hollinrake, Cathedral Custodian. I'm not in the picture because I took it. All those present rang the bell, using the new clapper and rope tassel. The Reverend Fraser McNaughton said, "We hope that this will become a regular tradition, that on what we call Royal Oak Sunday, the bell will be rung as a perpetual memory to the sailors who were lost in 1939. Bill Spence added that the ceremony was very moving, and I think if we can do that in years to come, as remembrance of the 835, it will be very worthwhile." HMS Royal Oak was lost 86 years ago, and the story of this memorial spans 77 of those years. Far from fading into memory, the importance of the memorial as a focus for remembrance appears to grow with every passing October. This growth in significance mirrors in many ways the prevailing modern appetite for war memorialisation. However, in the immediate post-war period and early 1980s, the development of a memorial to a ship that sank in local waters contradicts the national trend. At every stage, the developments in the memorial have been driven by local people for whom the story of the ship is still in recent, if not quite living memory. Every part of the memorial has a story to tell: its conception, its creation, and its meaning. And its location in St Magnus Cathedral is essential to the significance it has accrued. And there are all the wonderful people that helped me with the information, provided some of the photographs. So thank you to all of them, and thank you to you for listening.